It's really wonderful to see you, and thank you very much, Adrian, for inviting me today to chair this important session on cathedrals and social justice. As Adrian just said, we're going to have an excellent lineup of speakers this morning for you to be inspired and challenged by, and you should have a little handout with this on it, which explains to you how this plenary morning is going to work. I'm not going to take up any more time, but invite you to listen to Austen Ivereigh, who's going to come up here and talk to us first of all. Thank you very much.
Very good morning to you. It's lovely to be with you. Thank you for the privilege of addressing you in this great space and of addressing you who are custodians of other great spaces across this land. And I know that you're gathered to consider, perhaps even reconsider, the mission of UK cathedrals at this juncture of our national story as we emerge blinking from the dark forests of the pandemic, to survey anew, to look with new eyes at our fractured society, and to hear the call of the Holy Spirit to unite and reconcile that society, to dare to dream and to build with others something better. So I know that Pope Francis, who I know you would much rather have had here than me, but Francis would be delighted that our lockdown book, Let Us Dream, is being used by this conference, has been used by Adrian already in his excellent Church Times article, that it's being used possibly as a help to that discernment. As Pope Francis says in the prologue to the book, now more than ever, what is revealed is the fallacy of making individualism the organizing principle of society. What will be our new principle? So that's the challenge that he places before us in the book. And in his encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Brothers and Sisters All, which came out in October 2020, the purpose of that encyclical is to rescue the third ambition of modernity from cold storage. As Pope Francis says in the book, fraternity is today our new frontier. I've been told that fraternity it could be conceived, it's not in Latin languages, fraternita is brothers and sisters, but I've heard that fraternity in English can sound quite masculine, and siblinghood has been proposed as an alternative, but I can't get my head around it. I'm just going to use fraternity. What that means is if modernity, the big project of modernity, is defined as the pursuit of liberty, equality, and fraternity, then we're accepting that we have sought liberty and equality with determination these past 200 years. But without that neglected third leg of fraternity, the first two, equality and liberty, prove illusory or even ultimately damaging. And of course, fraternity has been neglected because it starts with humility before God, before creation, before our fellow creatures, human and non-human. And it starts with the embrace of our mutual belonging. That's where fraternity all begins. It all begins in that. Whereas, of course, the modern project has been so much concerned, above all, with bolstering power, the power of groups, the power of individuals. But now, in the midst of this crisis, revealed above all in the pandemic, we see the effects of the exaltation of the individual and of power. We see climate change fueled by consumerism, broadening inequality, the uprooting of community, greater division. So that's the question. What will be our new principle faced with this? Will we be able to recover fraternity? So anyway, I was delighted, as I say, that Let Us Dream was quoted by Adrian, not least because it was my own hope as Francis's collaborator in this book, that it would make his thinking, the Pope's thinking, accessible above all, and in particular to the English-speaking world. Because, frankly, papal books and literature often sound, to some extent, foreign. And sometimes they sound quite weird because of the vagaries of translation. So it was my ambition that here he would sound natural in both English and Spanish, which were the two languages we worked in, so that he would come close, we could hear him very directly. And without my ever making this explicit, at one point in the early stages of putting the book together, this was in the summer of 2020, Francis suggested out of the blue that we use English as the base language for the drafts, because it was quite complicated working in both languages, trying to do it at the same time. It was a typically gracious gesture on his part, but of course grace overspills, and the decision, that offer of his, had a very liberating effect on the process. And the result was, as I half-jokingly told him, he would be then the most authentically English-sounding pope since Nicholas Breakspere, who was, of course, the Hertfordshire-born head of the Catholic Church, Adrian IV, in the 1150s, history's first and only ever English pope. Anyway, he liked that very much, and he'll like the idea very much that he's been quoted here. But back to the article by the other Adrian, in which he mentions 3 challenges. Adrian Dorber does. The task of enabling dialogue at a time of deepening polarization, above all by listening to the excluded. Learning and teaching a deeper relationship with creation in the context of a climate emergency. And thirdly, helping to nurture a culture of mutual recognition and cultural and racial diversity. At a moment when grievances about exclusion, some of those grievances very well founded, are fueling social and political tensions. That's my reading, Adrian, of your 3 things. Now, this triad of concern maps very well onto the 4 contemporary realities to which the Francis pontificate and his social teaching, above all, is a response. The environmental crisis, the global economic system, human migration, and the rise of conflict and war, which, of course, we're seeing very dramatically at the moment. Each of these is the result of what Francis would call the change of era, the transformation, the historical transformation that we've been undergoing for many decades. It's not new. A change brought about, just as previous great changes have been brought about, above all by technological change. So it's in the light of this change of era, in the light of his discernment of spirits of this change of era, that Francis is seeking to clarify or re-clarify the mission of the church, while calling for the bold reform in the church's modus vivendi et operandi et cogitandi, to enable that mission. So this is about reform of the church to enable the mission which is discerned as being necessary for this moment. And I've sought to summarize that in the title for this talk, which is A Synodal Church for a Fraternal World. So I'm being followed by 2 fantastic speakers who are going to bring things nicely down to earth. And this afternoon you have Lorna on the environmental crisis. My contribution this morning is to really explain that discernment, to lay it out for you, to summarize how Pope Francis sees and seizes this moment, both the broader change of era, which I've just been describing, precipitated by global technology, as well as specifically this moment of transition of what we might call the early post-pandemic. So if I had to reduce these to 3 big ideas right at the beginning, I would say this: that there's a concept, there's a call to conversion, and then there's a catalyst of that conversion. So the concept is contained above all and beautifully expressed in his magnificent letter of 2015, Laudato Si, in the term integral ecology, which spells out an account of the mutual belonging of all creatures, human and non-human, rooted in a common home provided by a loving creator, the logic of gift. All is gift. And in this account, we've been uprooted from that logic by human-made systems and mentalities, above all the pursuit of power, that deny, ignore, undermine, or even threaten those ties, those bonds. And this is summed up in the term technocratic paradigm. So these terms may or may not be successful, but there they are: integral ecology, technocratic paradigm. That's the concept. The call to conversion is the call to fraternity, to recover the logic of gift and the relationships that implies, and the responsibility for each other and for the world, which are not a burden. The responsibility for each other and for the world is not a burden but a gift, which helps us to recognize ourselves in common kinship rather than as mere partners or associates bound by common interest or self-interest, mutual self-interest. In other words, a social order founded not on diversity brought to unity by associated self-interest, by, if you like, contractual relationships, which are fine in their place, but they're not enough. Nor is it a unity brought about by a homogeneity of ethnic or cultural origins or ideology, but rather an entering ever more deeply into the gospel understanding or logic of the neighbor. That's the call to conversion. And then thirdly, the catalyst of this conversion, catalytic converter, I suppose you'd say, is synodality. And for synodality for Francis is not what you in the Church of England would call synodal governance. We're not talking here about a form of governance which has evolved in the Anglican tradition, above all in the parliamentary system, but rather a synodal church at every level in which there is broad participation by ordinary faithful in the process of decision-making and discernment, by lots of getting together and mutual listening and spiritual conversation and discernment, which is then listened to by the bishops who then gather, and there's a process of discernment which takes place in which the authority takes the decisions having discerned, having listened to the people. So that's my attempt to understand this call to synodal conversion. So Francis said in 2015 that synodality is what God expects of the church of the third millennium. And those, when the Pope says things like that, that's quite strong words. What God expects of the church of the third millennium is synodality, a recovery of that form of togetherness and discernment which so characterizes the early church and which we see described in the Acts of the Apostles. And that's why he launched, and as I'm sure you know, has launched a 2-year synodal process, which for the first time is beginning in every parish and every diocese of the world. It's the biggest consultation exercise in human history, one might say, and which will conclude in October 2023 in Rome with the gathering of the bishops, having gathered again at a national and a continental level to consider what the people of God has been saying. So it's a remarkable process, and particularly for the Catholic Church, which for so long, for so many centuries, was caught up in a kind of centralist monarchical notion of authority. This is actually a very big deal. This is giving flesh to the Vatican II concept of the church as firstly the people of God. But this is the first time that we've really seen this expressed. But the point is that this is not just about governance. This is about learning a new way of being, a new culture within the church, which is part of our witness to enable the society that we serve to do the same, to learn a new culture of care and attentiveness to vulnerability, and having learnt that, to provide spaces for others to do so. So let me just dig into the origins of this discernment, because I think it might be helpful. Francis's discernment and the pontificate, which is its fruit, has its starting point in a gathering of the Latin American bishops in May 2007 in the shrine of Aparecida in Brazil. It happened in May 2007, the first time there had been any such gathering in 25 years. It was a profoundly synodal event. I think the most synodal event that the Catholic Church has ever seen in the modern era, preceded by 2 years of deliberation and consultation at a local level. But it was synodal also because of the way in which it happened. It was a kind of Pentecost moment for the Latin American church. And that's not actually just rhetoric, because literally the bishops went into it overwhelmed, as we so often are, by the challenges which face the church, by shrinking congregations, by growing secularity, and so on. All those challenges, overwhelmed, feeling unsure about them, and divided among themselves about how to respond. But then when it ended, when the meeting ended, they were united, a remarkable degree of unity, extraordinary, I don't know, 98, 99% or something, around this document which had been drafted by the man who is now Pope. And that unity and that consensus brought with it peace and joy and an apostolic boldness, a courage, an understanding of, and a sort of energy to evangelize, which was really quite remarkable. So although Aparecida helps the bishops to read the signs of the times, and I continue to say it's the most sophisticated signs of the times discernment that the church, any of the churches, have undertaken anywhere in the modern world in the last 50 years. But even though their diagnosis and their understanding of modernity was really important, this was not simply an intellectual exercise. What I think is striking about this is the way that they asked the question. What is the Holy Spirit asking of us in terms of our mission, and how must we change in order to carry out that mission? This is a very different kind of reform or question than is often accompanied by what we might call church renewal processes. What I'm inviting you to see is the humility of that, the trust in the power of the Spirit. We do not know the answers. We can speak honestly, we can read what we see, we can speak from experience, but the answer must come from the outside. It must be ultimately a gift from the outside. Now, I've called this in my book about the pontificate Wounded Shepherd, which is also available at the back, a key decision by the bishops to discern and reform rather than to lament and condemn. So often the church's response to secularity and to challenges is lamentation and condemnation. We lament the fact that people are leaving the church. We condemn the culture for abandoning Christianity. This is a very different approach. It's actually saying, how do we need to change in order to carry out the mission which Jesus entrusted to the church at the very start of its life? So, at Aparecida, Bergoglio, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the man who's now Pope Francis, gave a homily at Aparecida, which he gave almost identically in the speech to the cardinals in the meetings before the conclave which elected him. And this same speech, interestingly, had the same effect in Latin America among those bishops as it did among the cardinals in 2013, which is it left them convinced that he had been anointed by the Holy Spirit. What is it that he said in this speech? What is it that he articulated? Well, he presented the picture, a very dramatic picture, and this is, isn't it, the great gift of leaders, is that they can kind of name the choice, name the juncture. He presented this picture of the church as worldly and self-referential, in desolation, you would say in Ignatian spirituality, self-focused, paralyzed, clinging to what it feared to lose. And he calls for an evangelizing missionary church, open to the Spirit, open to the margins, open to the poor, that is on mission and evangelizing, that is willing also to be poor in its means. So this is the contrast that he drew. And the image he used in the shrine was, and in the speech actually, was of the paralyzed woman in Luke's gospel who's bent over, can only look down. Bent over, and this is what he said, the church bent over, looking at itself with the people of God off somewhere else. The people of God off somewhere else. So you often hear the lament that people have abandoned the church, but here it's the contrary. The church has withdrawn from the people. It has become clerical, distant, disconnected, remote, worldly, no longer evangelizing by proclaiming in words and deeds the unconditional mercy of God, but rather moralistic, legalistic, bureaucratic, judgmental, concerned with its own image, reflecting its own light rather than the light of Christ, which is exactly the words Bergoglio used in the conclave. Now, I'm presenting this very starkly, and as did he. But it's surprising how when you listen to the people of God about the church, it's actually what they say. And I say this because at the moment I'm part of a small team appointed by the Catholic bishops of England and Wales to study the synodal reports, the reports from each diocese. And it's quite remarkable how they are saying exactly this. They haven't withdrawn from the church, they love the church, but they're frustrated that the church is these things, remote, bureaucratic, that does not evangelize, that is not missionary, that is not giving them the tools to do what they feel called to do. So Aparecida begins with the state of the world rather than with the church, but it's really concerned with how the church needs to respond. But what is it that they saw in Aparecida? Well, none of this will be a surprise to you because the sociologists have been talking about it for years, but it's what one might call the fragmentation of belonging. And I know you've heard probably endless talks on this, how it is so much harder to belong to each other, to institutions, to families, to society. And that there is this kind of breakdown of frameworks of belonging under the pressure of technology and mobility. and how, as a result of this, it's much harder for people to plan and to commit to each other and to institutions. It's hard for people often to imagine a future. And this is what's very new about the contemporary age. And all of this, of course, accompanied by the gradual shrinking of and loss of Christian values and references from law and culture, so that Christianity is no longer transmitted primarily through Christian institutions and the law and the culture. So all of this they analyzed, and they saw that there was in people a great anguish, a great self-doubt, and a yearning for home, for mercy, for acceptance, for unconditional love, for the logic of gift, which is increasingly denied by both state and market. But they find that the church is too often unable to respond to that need because of its own self-preoccupation, because it's concerned with its own institutional survival in the context of secularity. So, put in Ignatian terms, it's about clinging to what you fear to lose, and so you'll then close in on yourself, and then you'll become deaf to the response of the cry of the poor, and indeed the cry of the people. So the answer in Aparecida was to accept that neo-Christendom was over, that Christianity is no longer transmitted primarily through law, culture, and institutions, but would increasingly come to depend on what they called in Spanish el encuentro fundante, which is roughly the foundational encounter. In other words, the first encounter, the experience of the encounter with Christ, which is always an encounter with the mercy of God. And that encounter produces or raises up missionary disciples, as in the early church. And the important thing about this is that it's an experience, it's not an idea. It's not something that you transmit as an idea, as a doctrine, but which is an encounter with the mercy of God is always an experience. And that this would require then a church which offers that experience, proclaims and performs that experience. A church of the poor, for the poor, one identified with the existential periphery. And poor in the sense that it depends not on occupying those spaces of power, not on law, status, and even on institutional prestige, but rather trusting in the Spirit and in grace. Humble, collaborative, synodal. A church that proclaims not that we are loved because we are good, that's what society would like you to believe, but rather that we have first been loved, and therefore we can love and become good because we have first been loved. And because we have been forgiven, we can forgive. A church, in other words, that doesn't evangelize by moralizing, but moralizes by evangelizing. So the conversion is from remoteness to closeness. And two of Francis's favorite words are closeness and concreteness. He loves using these words. Always be close and concrete, because they're incarnation words. That's how God saves us, by becoming close and concrete. To faith as an encounter and an experience, not firstly as an idea. In Evangelii Gaudium, which was his first programmatic document in 2013, he said, we must admit that the call to review and renew our parishes, and for parishes I'm sure you can stick in the word cathedrals, has not yet sufficed to bring them nearer to people, to make them environments of living communion and participation, and to make them completely mission-oriented. And the synodal process that he has launched has as its subtitle and objective communion, participation, and mission. So here we have in Aparecida, where Bergoglio in this same homily presents the image of a praying and adoring church, a church which goes out from itself, in which Pope people and pastors dialoguing as the Spirit inspires them. So the Spirit is speaking through all of us, all the baptized, and we are listening, and that's how the synodal church develops. So this calls for a listening church, and after Aparecida, and I've done some research on this and spoken to people in Buenos Aires and other Latin American cities, across Latin America there was an attempt to turn the cathedrals and basilicas of Latin American cities into listening stations, where people who had the charism of listening, the apostolate of the ear, as it's called in Spanish, could hear and listen to the joys and the anguish of the people and learn how to respond, and that the church could be in a process of continual reform in response to what it hears. And again, I suggest that this is all the origin of what Francis is seeking to do it. So what was heard from that listening? And what happens when you listen? And be interesting in your discussions. Perhaps you could share some of that. But from the listening in Latin America emerges this sense of a spiritual struggle. That on the one hand, we have this dehumanizing, depersonalizing force, which Laudato Si calls the technocratic paradigm, which in Let Us Dream, Francis puts it like this, a humanity impatient with the limits that nature teaches is a humanity that has failed to master the power of technology. It has changed our mindset, how we become more intolerant of limits. If it can be done, and if it's profitable, we see no reason why it shouldn't be done. We begin to believe in power, confusing it with progress, such that whatever boosts our control is seen as beneficial. So that's the technocratic paradigm. But on the other hand, we have the reaction to this among ordinary people, the growing awareness of creation and our damage to it, the growing outcry of people at what is happening, and the sensibility that has awoken in society, and thank God in our churches, against abuse of power, abuse of conscience, and of course sexual abuse, not least in our institutions, where these three have often gone together. But it's very striking how there's been this whole awakening to the whole idea of abuse. Almost didn't exist in the common vocabulary 30, 40 years ago, not in the same way we now have it with the Me Too movement and so on. So we have this awakening to the nature of power itself and the yearning for an integral ecology, not just the climate and the natural environment, land, water and air and stewardship, but rather a better relationship with each other and with our fellow creatures. And that means how we work, how we house ourselves, what our cities look like, the ecology of where we live, and our basic sense of responsible kinship with our fellow human beings, how we respond to each other, and above all, how we respond to each other's wounds, how we treat the foreigner at the gate. So that's the bigger picture, the background discernment, which brings us to the foreground, which is this present crisis of what I might call the pandemic. We always speak of crisis, don't we, as an opportunity, but we don't often explain what we mean by that, or how we can lose that opportunity or miss it. Francis said of the pandemic a lot, particularly in Easter 2020, that from a crisis like this, we can only come out better or worse, we can't come out the same. And when he said that, and he said it a lot, that's when I contacted him here, and I said, could you explain how that works? Could you explain how it is we can come out better? Or why it is that we resist the possibility of coming out better? And that's the basis of the book. So what I learned from him in the course of the book, and for me, Francis is a spiritual master above all, and I feel now like his disciple. I was his biographer, but I'm now happy to be his disciple, because he really has extraordinary capacity for discernment. What I learned from him during the book is that a crisis brings the grace of interruption, but it's a grace that can be and is often resisted. And that the best way to understand this in his teaching is through the Good Samaritan parable, which Francis uses a lot in Fratelli Tutti. The parable begins with a crisis, an act of violence which has left a person bleeding and beaten by thieves. And this fact interrupts, or threatens to interrupt, the plans of those who are on the same road. And then, of course, we have the famous two reactions. Francis notes in the prologue to Let Us Dream, when the Levite and the priest withdraw from the man, when they withdraw from the man, they're beating what he calls a functional retreat, by which I mean they're trying to preserve their own place, their roles and their status quo, faced with a crisis that tests them. So let's call this the response of withdrawal. And remember what I've just been saying about the discernment of a parricida about the church, that the church, faced with the tribulation of secularization, had withdrawn too often. So that's the choice of withdrawal. So the Samaritan, of course, provides the other example. To quote Francis, he stops, pulls up, acts, enters into the world of the wounded man, throws himself into the situation, into the other's suffering, and so creates a new future, end of quote. In other words, he allows himself to be struck by what he sees, knowing that the suffering will change him and will interrupt what he was doing, effectively. This is, of course, what we mean by embracing the cross, to trust and allow that suffering will open us to the new things that the Spirit wants to bring us. And this involves, to some extent, renouncing control. This will not be necessarily in the budget. It won't be part of the plan. And at this stage, I know I've lost the COOs among you. In Fratelli Tutti, Francis's encyclical on fraternity, he cites an essay by a Protestant philosopher, French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur, meditating on the Good Samaritan. So Ricoeur takes the great surprises of the parable that the despised foreigner turns out to be the real priest, mediating God's mercy, capable of self-transcendence, of creating a new story, and so on. And the other great surprise, Ricoeur references Matthew 25, the astonishment of both the just and the unjust in that story, that God was in the unknown poor whom they had either helped or not helped. So they had helped somebody who seemed unimportant and inconsequential, but who turned out to be, of course, extremely important. So the sign of the kingdom, and what that parable of the Good Samaritan is teaching us, is our considering all those who are in need to be of value, even if they appear not to be of value. And the mark of our fraternity is not what we do to them, although this matters, but above all, how we treat them. Francis puts it like this in the book: the problem is not feeding the poor or clothing the naked or visiting the sick, but rather recognizing that the poor, the naked, the sick, the prisoners, and the homeless have the dignity to sit at our table, to feel at home among us, to feel part of a family. This is the sign that the kingdom of heaven is in our midst. Now, Ricoeur's essay is called in French Le Socius et le Prochain, the associate and the neighbor. Associate, partner is probably a better word, the partner and the neighbor. And it's actually about institutions and how institutions, in a way, need to understand the logic of neighbor to be renewed. By making ourselves into a neighbor, we become capable of moving out beyond relationships of partnership, contractual, mutual self-interest, and so on, to embrace the other as a fellow human being, as a neighbor, as a brother and sister, and so create a new future. So another way of putting this is that in a crisis, institutions face the same temptation, either to withdraw into themselves in an attempt to preserve what it is that they were planning to do, uninterrupted, in which case they corrode, they decline, or they're capable of self-transcendence, of going out and being changed by the suffering that they see, and so create a new future. So that's true of institutions, it's true of countries, and it's true of our time. Reflecting on Ricoeur's essay, sorry about all the textual references here, but Francis in Fratelli Tutti notes that those who are capable only of being associates, if you stick to partnership, in other words, create closed worlds, frameworks within which there is little or no room for those who are not part of their group. So this, of course, is about how we respond to difference, the third of Adrian's three things. How we respond to a world of mass migration, of cosmopolitanism and so on, of the shaking up of identity. And of course, part of the reaction is an attempt to withdraw, to close down, to shore up our identity, national populism, America first, Brexit, sending refugees on a one-way ticket to Rwanda are all attempts to create closed worlds to try to cling to an identity which we perceive to be losing. So this is the drama that's captured in Fratelli Tutti, which the first chapter of which has a brilliant title, very somber title, Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. It's a really dark picture of the breakdown of solidarity, of alliances and fraternity in our world, and a stern warning that with the breakdown of the international order, we are entering into a situation of war. He wrote that in October 2020. In February this year, Putin demonstrated it exactly. But then the pandemic, and Fratelli Tutti, by the way, even though it was published in October 2020, was mostly written before the pandemic. In the pandemic, Francis begins to see something new, this grace of interruption, that through the suffering of COVID, there is a new consciousness of fraternity emerging in the awakening of the awareness of the dignity of the people. And Ricoeur, in this essay, observes that when we are struck by what he calls the failures of the social realm, wars or great historical disasters like pandemics, Only then, socially stripped, to use his words, do we perceive the depth of human relationships. And this, of course, is what Francis saw in that famous address from St. Peter's Square on March the 27th, 2020, when he spoke about how, in the face of so much suffering, we experience the priestly prayer of Jesus, that they may all be one. That the sight of suffering, the experience of suffering, causes us, hopefully, to respond in a more fraternal way. And in Let Us Dream, he sounds even quite hopeful about this. He says, the crisis has called forth the sense that we need each other, that the people still exists. There's a big idea of his in the book. There is an understanding of ourselves as a people. God has called us out into become one people, but we lose that sense of a people when we pursue too much of our own interest. And he goes on, now is the time for a new Nehemiah project. That's the first 8 chapters of Nehemiah he recommends. A new humanism that can harness this eruption of fraternity to put an end to the globalization of indifference and the hyperinflation of the individual. And the rest of the book, he explores what this might mean and might look like, this new humanism. But the point is that he sees the Spirit of God working in the hearts of ordinary people, inviting them to the primary encounter with the God of mercy, who reveals to them in their struggle and in their pain his love and their essential dignity, the struggle of forming a new people. And this is essentially what he's describing. But this is not optimism. The forces stacked against are formidable. The kingdom of God is always born in poverty, in powerlessness, when in worldly terms it seems impossible. And the challenge to us is, do we believe in that power? Do we believe in that the power of God is capable of working in this context? This is the context in which we are invited, you are invited, to make that sign that people yearn for, the sign that people seek, that when they see it, and when they find it, when it's authentic, they will come. Our churches and our cathedrals will fill again if we can offer that sign. So I'm not intending to offer any prescriptions here. This is for you to take away, and if any of this is helpful, to chew on and produce your own discernment against your own experience. But I want to end just then briefly with 2 words, which I think try to encapsulate this. The first word is vulnerability, and the second word is synodality. Vulnerability, the spiritual struggle which is at stake here is how we respond as a church, as a society, as individuals, to the vulnerability that is revealed in suffering. So call that weakness, call that need, call it the cry, whatever you want to call it. Whether of creation or of our fellow human beings. And our fellow human beings are creation. We're all created beings. So whether our non-human fellow creatures or our human fellow creatures or creation itself, the vulnerability that is revealed in the crisis, how do we respond to it? The invitation is to draw near. The invitation is to come close and to respond concretely. Listen, accompany, integrate. And the temptation is to withdraw back in an attempt to shore up our own identities faced with the new situation. And the corruption, that the real temptation, one might say, if you follow that temptation, the corruption is indifference to vulnerability and weakness, or even contempt. And you can recognize the power of the evil spirit by the way it reacts to weakness with furious contempt. And that's what we're seeing, are we not, at the moment in Russia, in Ukraine, when Russian forces, faced with the weakness and the vulnerability of ordinary Ukrainian citizens, are treating them so abominably. But we see it starkly there, but it's the same dynamic that we see in any evil in our society. So, vulnerability and how we respond. Francis's own response, perhaps the invitation that we can all think about, is synodality, and if you don't like the word, choose another word, but creating spaces for participation and listening to each other's experience, mechanisms by which tension and difference can be honestly expressed, but then trusting that the answer is found not in a competition of views, not in a parliamentary process of left versus right, but a collective search for the truth which is outside us and which is always a gift of the Spirit, overflowing, to use Francis's word, out from the outside, as it were, into us. And trusting that this process, this careful listening to the Spirit, is what will define our mission in this time of crisis. In other words, we don't have the answers, but by getting together and by honestly listening and careful listening to what the Spirit is saying through the experience, above all, of the poor, we will discover our mission. And then the question is whether we have the courage to change in order to carry that out. I'll give the last word to Francis. I see a people's movement calling for profound change, a change that flows from the roots, from the concrete needs of a people, that arises from the freedom and the dignity of a people. This is the deep change we need, change that arises from people capable of meeting, organizing, and coming up with truly human proposals. Thank you very much.